We are accustomed to thinking of Las Vegas as a city that never sleeps, but for 18-year-old Charlotte Davis, it became a place where reality simply shut down. Her Cadillac disappeared from radar as she drove into the desert, and we searched for her body for a month. I realized that sometimes a person's survival is just the beginning of a much more terrifying mystery. When I look at the neon signs of Las Vegas today, I don't see entertainment. I see an electric trap that blinds you so much that you don't notice the abyss right under your feet. My name is Detective Miller, and in 20 years on the force, I've learned one thing. The Nevada desert keeps secrets better than any safe at the Bellagio Casino. But the story of Charlotte Davis isn't just another file in the cold case archive. It's a story about how a person can vanish into thin air, leaving behind only the smell of burnt rubber and a deafening silence. It all started on May 14, 2010. Charlotte was 18. At that age, Vegas seems like a playground, not a cage. She worked as a waitress at the Velvet nightclub, a place where the air always smells of cheap perfume and spilled gin. That night, she finished her shift at 3 a.m. Surveillance cameras at the exit captured her waving to the security guard, adjusting the strap of her backpack, and getting into an old but well-maintained 1995 Cadillac, white metallic, which she loved so much. At 3:45 a.m., the Department of Transportation cameras at the city limits, near Highway 95, caught the last glimpse of her car's streamlined silhouette. She was heading north, a single car in a sea of sand and darkness. And that was it. Charlotte Davis simply ceased to exist in the digital world. When she didn't show up for lunch with her parents the next day, they didn't immediately sound the alarm. Youth, Vegas, sleeping over at a friend's house, they thought. But by the evening of May 15th, Charlotte's phone was already out of range. When I first entered their living room, I saw the open book she had been reading and her half-finished cup of tea on the table. The house breathed her presence, but the girl herself was nowhere to be found. We sent helicopters into the air. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 50 volunteers and officers combed every mile of the Nevada desert along her possible route. We looked for skid marks, broken glass, anything. The desert in May is a cruel place. The sun burns everything alive, and the wind sweeps away traces faster than you can record them. Charlotte's parents, Helen and Mark, appeared on local television every day. I remember Helen's eyes. There were no tears, just the emptiness that people have when their world has just shattered into tiny pieces. "Just bring her home," she pleaded into the camera. But the desert was silent. No witnesses, no ransom calls. We checked her ex-boyfriends, club patrons, even random truck drivers who were on the highway that night. Nothing. Charlotte's Cadillac seemed to have vanished along with her. After a month, the investigation reached a dead end. At the station, people began to whisper about a voluntary disappearance, that the girl was simply tired of living in debt and decided to start over somewhere in California. But I knew that people don't abandon their favorite cars and leave their parents in such despair without a good reason. I remember closing her file that evening. In the photo, Charlotte was smiling, light hair, a light dress, a look full of hope. I didn't know yet that a month later my phone would ring at 2 a.m. and the voice on the other end would say, "Miller, we found her, but you won't believe where." She was hundreds of miles from Vegas, in a place where no one would ever think to look for a girl from the bright lights of the big city. Exactly 1 month had passed. Life in Las Vegas continued to bubble, the neon signs still promising easy happiness, and the Charlotte Davis case began to gather a thin layer of dust on my desk. But 700 miles from the oasis in Wyoming, where the wind blows across endless prairies and the sky seems too big for one person, the story took its first sharp turn. It happened on June 16th. Jack Torrance, a truck driver with 10 years of experience, was transporting a shipment of building materials to Casper. Around 2 a.m, his old Peterbilt sneezed, let out a cloud of smoke, and stalled right in the middle of the desert highway. Cell phone service there is a luxury Jack didn't have. The closest place to anything resembling civilization turned out to be the dusty Rose Inn. It was a motel that had died back in the 80s. The pink paint was faded, most of the windows were broken, and the sign had long since lost its R, turning into a gloomy, dusty doze. Jack went there hoping to find a landline phone or at least a jug of water. He later recounted during questioning that the air was strangely still that night and the smell of dry wormwood seemed sweet, almost sickening. He knocked on the door of the administration office. Silence. But as he passed room number 7, he heard a sound. It wasn't a scream or a cry. It was a rhythmic, quiet tapping, as if someone were lightly tapping their palm on the wooden floor. Tap, tap, tap. Jack pushed the door. It wasn't locked. When the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness of room number 7, he first thought he was seeing a mannequin. A girl was sitting on an old bed covered with a yellowed sheet. She was wearing a clean, ironed blue dress, not the one she had disappeared from Vegas in. Her hair was carefully combed, and her hands were neatly folded on her knees. It was Charlotte, but it wasn't the girl from the photo. Her eyes? I've seen a lot, but I'll never forget that look. They were wide, unblinking, and looked through Jack into the emptiness of the wall. She didn't move when he approached. She didn't flinch when he touched her shoulder. She was alive, but her spirit seemed to have been sucked out of her body, leaving only a shell. Her purse lay on the nightstand next to her, the same one she had left Velvet Night with. Next to it was a small piece of paper torn from a notebook. On it, in a firm, confident hand, was written, "You are safe from the lights here." No signature, no explanation. Jack, forgetting about his truck, picked up the girl. She weighed no more than 40 kilograms, like a bird, and carried her to the highway, where he was able to flag down a passing car. When I got a call from Natrona County Medical Hospital in Casper, I couldn't believe my ears. "Is she alive?" was all I could ask. "Physically, yes," replied the doctor on duty. "But she's in a state of deep catatonic shock. She doesn't speak, doesn't respond to stimuli, and barely moves. Detective, you need to come here. And there's something else." I took the first flight out. When I entered the room, it smelled of antiseptic and fear. Charlotte was lying on the bed, as motionless as she had been in that abandoned motel. The doctor showed me the test results. "She's well fed, Miller. There are no signs of exhaustion or violence. She was fed and cared for. Her nails are trimmed, her clothes are new. Whoever held her didn't just kidnap her. They kept her like a precious thing." I opened her purse, hoping to find a clue. Everything was inside: a mirror, lipstick, a driver's license. Only one thing was missing: the keys to her Cadillac. I stood by the hospital window, looking at the snow-capped peaks of the Wyoming mountains, trying to understand. How did a girl who disappeared in the heart of the Nevada desert end up in an abandoned motel hundreds of miles away, looking like she had just left a beauty salon, but with her soul shattered into pieces? And what did that mysterious message about lights mean? The answer came sooner than I expected, and it was much more terrifying than just kidnapping. As I stepped off the plane at Casper Airport, the Wyoming air hit my face in a way that was completely different from the dry heat of Vegas. Here, it was sharp, saturated with the smell of pine needles and an approaching storm. In my pocket was a copy of that same note. "You are safe from the lights here." Those words stuck in my head. They didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like a manifesto. Detective Miller is me, a man who believes in numbers, protocols, and logic. But from the first minutes of my stay at Natrona County Medical, logic began to crack. I stood in front of the glass partition of the intensive care unit. Charlotte lay there, connected to monitors that beeped rhythmically, counting the seconds of her new, broken life. "Look at her hands, Detective," Dr. West whispered as he approached me. "She disappeared a month ago. According to the official version, she should have been wandering the desert or hiding in some slum. But her nails, they're not just clean. They're professionally manicured. Her skin has no sunburn, which she would inevitably have gotten in Nevada. What's more, she smells like lavender soap. Someone wasn't just holding her captive. Someone was playing house. But the real shock came later that day. While I was studying her medical records, my colleagues in Wyoming sent a report about the discovery of her car. And that's when the puzzle finally fell into place. Charlotte's white Cadillac was found burned to the ground in an abandoned quarry near the town of Evanston. This is right on the border with Utah, 300 miles from the motel where the girl was found. Experts determined that the car had been burned 20 days earlier, that is, 10 days after her disappearance. I got in the car and drove to the quarry. It was a gloomy place, rusty excavators, piles of rubble, and silence broken only by the whistling of the wind in the metal structures. The Cadillac's frame looked like the skeleton of a prehistoric creature. It had been burned so thoroughly that nothing remained inside. No DNA, no fingerprints, no personal belongings. I stood at the edge of the quarry, my hands in my coat pockets, trying to retrace her route. On May 14th, she leaves Vegas. She is seen on Highway 95. Then, silence. 10 days later, her car is burned in Evanston. And 20 days later, she shows up at an abandoned motel near Casper. That's a 300-mile difference. Between Evanston and Casper, hundreds of miles of deserted roads, snow-covered mountain passes, and forests. How did she get there? Barefoot? In a blue dress? Impossible. Someone transported her. But why burn the car in one place and leave the victim in another in such a perfect, almost sterile condition? I returned to Casper and met with the local sheriff. We spread the map out on the hood of his patrol car. "Look, Miller," he said, pointing to the map. "Here's the quarry. Here's the Dusty Rose Motel. Between them is nothing. But there's one thing. The whole area is crisscrossed with old logging roads that aren't marked on GPS but are used by locals. If someone wanted to transport a girl unnoticed, they wouldn't take I-80. They would go through the mountains. I began studying recordings from every possible camera on private property between Evanston and Casper. It was hellish work, thousands of hours of grainy video from farms, sawmills, and abandoned gas stations. By the third day, my eyes were refusing to focus. And then I saw it. Footage from a camera at the West Edge service station, located 40 miles from where the car was burned. The time, 11:45 p.m., the night the Cadillac burned. The video shows a dark pickup truck with a covered bed. It doesn't stop, it just drives by. But in the headlights, something white flashes in the bed for a moment. It wasn't fabric. It was the glint of metal, the same glint that the white metallic paint of a 1995 Cadillac gives off. Whoever kidnapped Charlotte didn't just kill her car. He took it with him on a trailer or in the back of a large vehicle. He carried it like a trophy. I returned to the hospital. Charlotte opened her eyes for a moment. I moved closer, hoping for some kind of sign. "Charlotte," I called softly. "You're safe. Who did this? Who brought you to the motel?" She slowly turned her head toward me. Her lips trembled. I leaned in, my ear almost touching her face. "The light," she whispered so softly that at first I thought I had imagined it. "Too much light in Vegas." He said, "There, in the dark." I could breathe. And again she fell into a stupor. I stepped out into the hallway, my hands shaking. This was no ordinary criminal. This was someone who sincerely believed he was doing good, someone who considered himself a savior. And that savior was somewhere nearby right now, perhaps watching the hospital, waiting for his rescue to wake up and speak. We started checking everyone who had access to the abandoned motel. Landowners, former employees, suppliers. And that's when the first name came up that made my heart beat faster. Elias Ward, a man who knew these roads like the back of his hand, a man who drove past the Dusty Rose every week with a load of groceries. But there was one problem. According to the records, Elias Ward was a model citizen. No speeding tickets, no complaints. He was invisible, and invisible people are the most dangerous predators. That night I realized for the first time we weren't looking for a killer. We were looking for someone who wanted to be everything to Charlotte, her father, her God, her prison guard. And he wouldn't stop until he brought her back to his silence. In missing persons investigations, there is a moment that we detectives call the boiling point. That's when the evidence starts pouring in, and it seems like we're just one step away from the solution. That night in Casper, I was sure we had him. On the morning of June 18th, the police arrested Ryan Scott, Charlotte's ex-boyfriend, 22 years old, hot-tempered, a pile of unpaid fines, and a record of domestic violence. He was seen at Velvet Night 3 days before the girl's disappearance. They were arguing loudly in the parking lot. What's more, his cell phone records showed that he left Las Vegas 2 hours after Charlotte on May 14th. When I entered the interrogation room, Ryan looked like a man who had lost everything. His t-shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were red, and his hands were shaking as if he were trying to hold a jackhammer. "Where were you on May 14th, Ryan?" I sat down across from him, placing a photo of the burned Cadillac on the table. I was just following her," he said, covering his face with his hands. "She wanted to break up with me, said she was leaving. I didn't believe her. I wanted to talk. I followed her to the state line. It was classic. Jealousy, stalking, a fit of rage on a deserted road. I could already see how this case would end. We found a gas can and an old map of Wyoming in his car. It seemed to all add up. But in this job, you learn quickly. If it looks too simple, you're looking in the wrong direction." While I was pressing Ryan, my partner, Sergeant Harper, was checking the cameras at the West Edge service station I mentioned earlier. She burst into the interrogation room without knocking. Her face was pale. "Miller, come out here for a minute." In the hallway, she handed me a printout of the timestamps. "Ryan Scott couldn't have burned that car," she said quietly. "Why?" "Because at 12:30 a.m., when the Cadillac drove into the quarry near Evanston, Ryan was filling up his Ford at a station in Utah, 200 miles away. We have the security camera footage. He was buying coffee and cigarettes while someone else drove Charlotte's car off the cliff. It was a cold shower. We had a jealous fool who was indeed stalking her, but he lost sight of her at the Nevada border. Someone else intercepted Charlotte right under his nose, someone much more professional, quieter, and more dangerous. I returned to the materials on Elias Ward. A food supplier, 48 years old, he lives alone on a small farm on the outskirts of Casper. His van, a white GMC Savannah, passed through all the key points on our route. But Ward was like a ghost. No social activity, no friends. I decided to take an unconventional approach. Instead of going to him with a warrant, which I didn't have enough grounds to obtain anyway, I started digging into his business activities. It turned out that Ward rented 4 private garages in different parts of Natrona County. Officially, they were for storing excess goods. But why would a food supplier need a garage in the industrial zone of Casper, where there isn't even electricity for refrigerators? We set up surveillance. On June 19th at 2 in the afternoon, Ward's white van pulled up to one of the garages. He got out of the car, an ordinary man in a flannel shirt, with gray hair at his temples. He looked like someone's nice neighbor. He stayed inside for about an hour. When he drove away, Harper and I took a chance. The lock was old. It took 30 seconds to pick it. When the garage door creaked open, I was hit by a smell I didn't expect to find in a supplier's garage. It wasn't the smell of gasoline or rotten potatoes. It was the smell of Sea Breeze laundry detergent and baby powder. Inside, it was spotless. The concrete floor was washed to a shine. In the corner stood an old sofa covered with a blanket, and next to it was a small table. On the table was a battery-powered lamp and a stack of magazines. But something else caught my attention. At the back of the garage, a small room had been set up with screens. Behind them, we found a shelf. There was no food there. There were neatly folded clothes. Women's clothes. I picked up a clear plastic bag. Inside were a pair of red sneakers. I recognized them instantly. They had been featured in the 2007 case of Lillian Rose's disappearance. Next to them was a silver hair clip that belonged to another girl who had disappeared 3 years ago on I-15. "My God!" Harper gasped, picking up a pair of sunglasses from the shelf. "He's been collecting them for years." But the most frightening thing was in the center of the table. There was a recent photo of Charlotte, taken from a distance. She was still in Vegas, near the Velvet nightclub. On the back of the photo was written in the same confident handwriting, "Subject number 4. Too much light. Needs darkness." At that moment, I realized that Ward hadn't just kidnapped her. He was saving her from a world he considered dirty and too bright. He was preparing her for this isolation, just as one prepares a rare animal for life in captivity. Suddenly, Harper's radio rang. It was the security guard from the hospital. "Detective Miller, we have a problem. A visitor just came to Davis's room. He says he's her uncle." The deputy let him in because he had documents and flowers with him. My heart sank into my stomach. "Harper, describe him," I shouted into the radio. "A gray-haired man, medium height, wearing a gray jacket." It was Ward. He didn't run away. He realized that Charlotte was the only witness who had seen his true self when he transported her, and now he had come to finish the rescue process. "Lock down the floor," I shouted, rushing to the car. "Don't let anyone out." I knew we weren't going to make it. The hospital was a 10-minute drive away, and Ward was already behind the closed doors of her room. When I burst into the lobby of Natrona County Medical, my lungs burned from the frosty air, and my heart pounded against my ribs like a caged animal. I saw Harper standing by the elevators, frantically pressing the call button. The surveillance monitors we had set up in our makeshift headquarters on the first floor showed only the empty fourth-floor hallway. There were no cameras in room 402, where Charlotte was lying. Patient privacy laws sometimes become a killer's best friend. "He's been there for 3 minutes," Harper said without looking at me. Her hand was on the handle of her service clock. We didn't wait for the elevator. We rushed to the stairs. 4 flights, each of which seemed like a kilometer. My head was spinning with the things we found in Ward's garage. Neat packages, the smell of laundry detergent, messianic fanaticism in every fold of those girls' clothes. Ward wasn't a serial killer in the classic sense. He was a collector of souls, which he plucked from the filth of the world and preserved in his sterile darkness. And now that one of his exhibits had spoken, he had come to shut her up for good. We flew up to the 4th floor. The deputy sheriff, a young guy named Jenkins, was sitting on a chair by the door. He looked completely calm. "It's okay, detective," he said, standing up. "Her uncle is there. He brought flowers. She even smiled a little when she saw him." "You're an idiot, Jenkins," I yelled, pushing him aside. I didn't knock. I threw open the door to the room with one swift movement. The room was dimly lit and silent, broken only by the hissing of the oxygen machine. Ward was sitting on the edge of Charlotte's bed. His back was straight, and his hand was resting on her thin wrist. On the nightstand was a bouquet of white lilies, flowers usually brought to funerals or as a sign of purity. He slowly turned his head. His face showed neither fear nor aggression. It was the face of a man who was 100% sure he was right. "You're in the way, detective," he said in a quiet, almost gentle voice. "Charlotte needs peace and quiet. There was too much noise in Vegas. You're part of that noise. Hands behind your head, Ward. Slowly." Harper already had him at gunpoint. Charlotte looked at him with the same numbness, but now there was something else in her eyes. Not horror. It was more like submission. The psychological pressure he had exerted on her during that month in the motel had not been in vain. He had tamed her. Ward didn't move. He continued to stroke the girl's hand. "You think you're saving her?" He smiled slightly. "Look at her. She was a nobody in that club, a cog in a machine that turns people into trash. I gave her silence. I gave her a clean dress and a prayer. I saved her from the fires that burn the soul. You kidnapped her, burned her car, and kept her in an abandoned motel, I said, moving step by step toward the bed. We found your garages, Elias. We found Lillian Rose's things. It's over. At the mention of Lillian's name, his fingers twitched for a moment. That was my opening. Was Lillian unclean too? I asked, trying to distract him from Charlotte. What did you do to her when she wanted to return to the light? She didn't want to. Ward's voice became hard as stone. She just didn't understand grace. She started screaming. And in my world, there is no place for screaming. At that moment, I saw Ward's hand reach into his jacket pocket. I didn't wait. I lunged forward, throwing my whole weight on him. We fell to the floor, knocking over the IV stand. Glass shattered, and the medical monitor's piercing alarm sounded. Charlotte began to scream, thin, childlike, covering her ears with her hands. Ward fought with frenzied strength. It wasn't the strength of an athlete. It was the strength of a religious fanatic. He was trying to get something out of his pocket. I was sure it was a knife or a syringe. She belongs to silence, he gasped, trying to grab my throat. You're sending her back to hell. Harper jumped up and hit him in the back of the head with the butt of her gun. Ward went limp. It wasn't a knife that fell out of his pocket. It was a small vial of clear liquid and a handkerchief. He wasn't going to kill her. He was going to put her back to sleep and take her away. Right out of the hospital, under the police's nose. Jenkins ran into the room, breathing heavily. Call for backup and handcuff him, I ordered, getting up and wiping the blood from my broken lip. I looked at Charlotte. She was huddled in the corner of the bed, her knees pulled up to her chin. Her gaze darted from me to the unconscious Ward. She didn't look relieved. She looked like someone who had just had her only support taken away, even if that support was her tormentor. It's over, Charlotte, I said, trying to make my voice as soft as possible. She looked at me, and I saw such a deep emptiness in her eyes that I felt cold. Will there be light again? She asked. Will it be very loud? I didn't know how to answer. All I knew was that Elias Ward would never touch another girl again. But I also understood that the fight for Charlotte was just beginning. And that fight would take place not in the courtroom, but in her own mind. There were no winners that night in Casper. There was only one monster in custody, and one girl who was afraid of the sun. I stepped out onto the hospital balcony and lit a cigarette. The mountain ranges of Wyoming darkened against the starry sky. Somewhere out there, in those forests, there could still be garages we didn't know about. And somewhere out there, the silence that Ward considered sacred still reigned. After Ward was let out of the hospital in handcuffs, the air in room 402 was left with a heavy, sweet smell of lilies and stale fear. I looked at Charlotte, who was still trembling, and realized that we hadn't just arrested a kidnapper. We had destroyed the entire universe he had built around her. I didn't sleep for the next 48 hours. My home became the interrogation room and the archives, where we peeled away layer after layer of Elias Ward's mask. It turned out that this inconspicuous supplier had a messianic complex so powerful that it bordered on absolute madness. Ward did not consider himself a criminal. In his twisted perception, he was the last righteous man in a world drowning in sin. We found his diaries in a secret compartment in that same garage in Casper. They were leather notebooks, filled with small, perfect handwriting. May 14th, subject number 4 spotted. She stands in the neon light, and that light eats away at her like acid. She smiles at people who see her as nothing more than a commodity. I must wash that smile away. I must give her silence, read one of the entries. He had been watching Charlotte for weeks. He had studied her every shift, every route. When she left Vegas, he was already waiting for her at a gas station outside the city. He didn't kidnap her by force on the highway. He rigged her car to break down by putting abrasive in the oil. And when she stopped on the side of the road, panicked in the middle of the desert at night, he appeared as a Good Samaritan in his white van. During questioning, Ward calmly recounted, with a slight hint of pride, how he loaded her Cadillac onto a camouflage trailer and sedated her with a mixture of ether and tranquilizers. He drove her north across 3 states, avoiding large cities. He burned her car in a quarry, not to hide the evidence, but to symbolically destroy her connection to her past life. "You don't understand, Miller," he said to me across the table, looking me straight in the eye with his piercing, almost transparent gaze. Charlotte was a wounded bird in a cage of lights. I brought her to the Dusty Rose Motel because time stood still there. I taught her to be silent. I taught her that the sun was the enemy. You call it kidnapping. I call it disinfecting the soul. But the real climax came when we realized why he had returned to the hospital. Charlotte was special to him. The previous girls whose belongings we found didn't make it. They either went crazy or tried to escape too aggressively. And then Ward released them into the great silence, a euphemism for the nameless graves in the forests of Wyoming. Charlotte began to give in. She stopped resisting. She began to see him as the only person who cared about her. Stockholm Syndrome, mixed with psychotropic treatment, created a terrible bond. And when the truck driver found her in room number 7, it was a disaster for Ward. He couldn't let his child see the dirty light of Vegas again. When I entered the room, Ward continued, his voice suddenly low and vibrating, I saw her looking out the window, at the city, at the streetlights. She was already starting to get infected again. I wanted to give her the medicine, one last dose of peace. I remembered that handkerchief with the vial. It wasn't just a tranquilizer. The lab confirmed it. It was a lethal dose of morphine. He was going to save her forever by killing her right in her hospital bed so she could never tell the police about his paradise in the desert. He thought he was saving her from testifying against him, but in his mind it seemed like an act of supreme mercy. When I returned to Charlotte the next day, she was sitting in a chair by the window. She was pale, almost transparent in the rays of the morning sun, which she had come to hate so much over the past month. "He said you would take me back," she whispered without turning her head. "To the club, to the noise, to the people who look right through me." "No, Charlotte, we're taking you home." She finally looked at me. There was no joy at her release in her eyes. There was a deep, icy sadness for the peace that the monster had imposed on her. "I don't have a home anymore, Detective." He burned it down along with the Cadillac. I realized that Ward had won. Even in handcuffs, even behind bars, he had achieved his goal. He had erased the 18-year-old girl who once dreamed of life. Before me was a woman who would forever remain in the shadow of that abandoned motel. The investigation continued, and we found more and more evidence of his messianism. But I knew that the most important thing had already happened. The real tragedy was not that he had stolen her, but that he had made her believe that darkness was the only safe place. In the evening, the hospital in Casper resembles a huge glass aquarium immersed in the blue darkness of Wyoming. The lights in the corridors dim, footsteps echo on the linoleum, and the air is permeated with the smell of evening rounds and anxiety. I stood in the basement archive room, where the air was heavy and dry. In front of me, the monitor flickered with surveillance camera footage from the past week. I was looking for a pattern, a regularity, any shadow that Ward might have left before we caught up with him. My finger hovered over the pause button. The screen showed a video from 3 days ago. The hospital entrance. In the crowd of visitors, I saw a man in a plain gray jacket. He wasn't hiding. He was holding a newspaper and a cup of coffee. He was just standing by the vending machine, looking at the elevators. 15 minutes of immobility. Then he left. He wasn't just watching, I whispered to myself. He was studying the guard schedule. Suddenly, the monitor screen from another angle, the one showing the 4th-floor lobby in real time, caught my attention. My heart skipped a beat. The same gray jacket, the same confident gait. Ward was coming out of the elevator. In one hand, he held a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in crisp paper. In the other, he clutched a folder to his chest. He looked like the perfect uncle who had come from far away to visit his beloved niece. I saw him approach Jenkins. The young deputy asked him something. Ward smiled. I could almost feel that warm, poisonous smile through the screen and showed some kind of ID. Jenkins nodded and gestured for him to pass. No, no, no. I grabbed my radio, but in the basement archive, the connection was nothing but static. Jenkins, you're committing suicide. I rushed to the door. Every step on the concrete stairs sent pain through my knees, but I didn't feel it. Only one thought pulsed through my head. Ward knows we're in the garages. He knows the noose is tightening. And he didn't come to save her a second time. He came to erase the only evidence of his defeat. When I flew up to the 4th floor, the hallway was strangely quiet. Jenkins was sitting in his seat, happily looking through a magazine. Where is he? I grabbed him by the lapels of his uniform so hard that the buttons almost flew off. Who? Charlotte's uncle? He's in the ward, detective. Calm down. He's not her uncle, son. He's a beast. I pushed him away and threw open the door to Ward 402. I expected to see a struggle, a knife at her throat, blood on the white sheets. But what I saw was much worse. Ward wasn't standing over her. He was sitting on a chair next to the bed, holding Charlotte's hand. The girl wasn't screaming. She wasn't even trying to break free. She was looking at him with the same empty eyes she had looked at the truck driver at the motel. But now they had a desperate, childlike calm. Charlotte, sweetheart, Ward's voice was soft as velvet. You know what they'll do. They'll take you back to the light. There will be cameras again, people who want a piece of you again. Do you want to go back to where no one knows your name except the check at the casino? No, she whispered barely audibly. Only I know what true silence sounds like. He squeezed her fingers slightly. Only with me have you been pure. Let's go. I've got everything ready. The van is waiting downstairs. He looked up at me. There was no aggression in his eyes, only the deep, convincing confidence of a messiah. You're too late, Miller. You can't save what no longer belongs to you. I slowly reached for my gun, but my hands were shaking slightly. Not out of fear for myself. I was afraid that any sudden movement would cause him to press that invisible button in her brain that he had so carefully installed over the past month. Let go of her hand, Elias. My voice sounded hoarse. Right now. She won't let go herself, he replied with a slight sadness. Right, Charlotte? The girl looked at me, then at him, and suddenly she pressed herself against his hand, like a beaten puppy against its owner. It was the real denouement. He hadn't broken her body. He had occupied her mind. Ward stood up calmly. He didn't try to run away or grab a weapon. He just stood next to the bed, looking down at me, even with a gun pointed at him. You can lock me up, he said when the sound of boots from reinforcements could be heard in the hallway. You can even kill me, but you'll never get her out of the room I left her in. When the SWAT team stormed into the room and knocked him to the floor, Ward didn't even flinch. He just closed his eyes and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. And Charlotte? She started to cry. It wasn't a cry of relief. It was the quiet, hopeless cry of a person who had lost the last person she believed understood her. I stood over them, feeling completely powerless. We had caught him. The case was solved. But looking at the girl who turned away from the light of the SWAT team's flashlights, I knew that Ward had left something in that room that no law and no prison could fix. The 2011 trial of Elias Ward was to Wyoming what the Manson trial was to California. It was not just a criminal case, it was a clash of two worlds. The real world, where laws and evidence exist, and the world that Ward had created in his sick imagination. I sat in the front row of the courtroom every day, watching this man in a cheap suit continue to hold himself with the dignity of a martyr. The prosecution's case was ironclad. We gave the court everything: surveillance footage, the missing girl's belongings, Ward's diaries, and, of course, the doctor's testimony. But the most frightening moment came when the psychiatrists took the stand. It turned out that Ward did not use brute physical force on Charlotte in the sense that we are accustomed to. He used what experts called sensory deprivation in combination with psychotropic substances. He kept her in complete darkness for 20 hours a day. When he turned on the light, it was blindingly white, accompanied by stories of how the outside world had burned down, how Las Vegas had turned to ashes, and how she was the last pure soul he had managed to snatch from the fire. He convinced the 18-year-old girl that her parents had abandoned her, that the police were looking for her only to return her to slavery at the club. After a month of such therapy, Charlotte began to see him as her only protector. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping, unlawful detention, and involvement in the disappearance of other women whose bodies we never found. He just smiled when asked about the coordinates of other oases. But what happened to Charlotte? That's what still torments me. After the trial, her parents tried to take her home to Nevada. They hired the best rehab specialists and showered her with love. But Vegas no longer existed for her. Every time she saw the strip lights, she started to suffocate. For her, every neon sign was a scream from which it was impossible to hide. 6 months later, she just left home. No drama, no notes. I found her a few months later. She didn't go back to Vegas. She went back to Wyoming, to a small town called Glenrock, 20 miles from Casper. Charlotte Davis died in that motel, and another woman took her place. She dyed her hair dark, changed her last name, and got a job at the local library. It was always quiet there, which she loved so much under Ward's supervision. She never answers calls from her past life and never gives interviews. The last scene I saw with my own eyes when I came to Wyoming on other business is forever etched in my memory. It was late autumn 2012. I was driving down the highway past the Exit Wyoming sign. A lone figure in a long gray coat stood on the side of the road. It was Charlotte. She stood at the state line and looked at the mountains beyond, where the road began to head south toward Nevada. I slowed down, wanting to call out to her, but something stopped me. She stared for a long time at the sunset, which painted the peaks a blood-red color. And then she just turned around. Slowly, confidently, she walked back toward the city, toward the harsh mountains and permafrost. She chose to stay where she had once been found broken, but now it was her choice. She didn't run away from her darkness. She made it her home. Ward wanted to save her from the lights of the big city, and in a sense, he succeeded. He took away the future we thought was normal and left her in silence, where she was now her own master and prisoner. I often think about that note. Here you are safe from the lights. Perhaps in this twisted world we live in, for Charlotte, it was the only truth she could accept. I closed her file forever, but every time I see the lights of the big city, I remember the silence of Glenrock and the girl who went into the mountains to never be found again.